The Page, a Life is Story podcast. I'm Josh Olds, and today we're having a very important discussion with Dr. Julia Sadusky. Dr. Sadusky is a licensed clinical psychologist who's, among other things, a fellow at the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute at Wheaton, where she works with the director of the institute, Mark Yarhouse. Mark and Julia have written two books. The first is Emerging Gender Identities, Understanding the Diverse Experience of Today's Youth. That was published a couple years ago by Brazos Press. And the latest is Gender Identity and Faith, which was published by IVP Academic and released, I think, a few months ago at this point. Dr. Sadusky, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's so good to be with you, Josh.
Now, your academic focus is the intersection of gender identity and faith, particularly looking at how Christians, as Christians, we should approach the issue of gender diversity. It's increasingly something that we see on the news, in culture. It's being talked about, and it can be a very difficult subject. It's a very, very complex subject, a very intimate subject, a very personal subject. What was it that drew you toward this academic focus?
Great question. Yes, so I was studying at Regent under Mark Yarhouse, and he was doing some writing on gender dysphoria, and I was part of his research team. And so a passion of mine had really been accompanying and learning more about the experiences of sexual minorities, so people who experience attraction to people of the same sex. And so I was really drawn to that through personal experiences of people sharing about that in my own personal life, family, friends, and me really wrestling with what does it look like to better show up for those people I love and help them think through the questions they're really asking about what it looks like to integrate faith and sexual identity. So to be honest with you, Josh, I really didn't, to my knowledge at least, have much of a frame of reference for the gender identity discussion or know of many people in my personal life who had openly shared that experience with me. But Mark was writing on that, he was supervising me. And so honestly, at that time, people were just coming to see me for whom that was their story. And you know, the way I often think about it is God really expanded my heart at that time to care for, love, and want to better show up for gender minorities, much in the ways that he had for sexual minorities. And as I've done that work, it's really become more of a passion of writing and speaking for me as I've seen the ways we're doing poorly, I think, as faith communities in this space.
What in particular, how have you seen faith communities do poorly in this area, and what do you think we can do to be better? That's a whole conversation. I understand that. That's hours and hours of conversation. What have you seen personally to say, like, hey, these are some small things. These are some simple things that don't require huge paradigmatic theological overhauls. These are just things we can do to be hospitable and to be kind and to be understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the first question we have to wrestle with as members of a faith community is, do we actually want people who are wrestling with gender identity in our faith communities? Because I think what I sometimes bump up against as a professional consulting with churches or personally hearing the stories of my clients is it's not evident to my clients or to loved ones in this space that they are wanted in those faith communities. And so I think really figuring out, are we going to put in the effort to make adjustments that we'll need to make? Or if we're not willing to do that, how do we be honest about that on the front end instead of stringing people along, a bit more of a bait and switch, which of course, as a Christian, I think we're called to go and take those steps. But again, if people are so steeped in some of the politicization of this topic and some of the vitriol that gets thrown around, I don't think that they will do very well serving people. So I guess that's the first thing, is moving down into the present moment with the person across from me, as opposed to seeing this person across from me as a representative of political movements, ideologies that perhaps people of faith have questions or deep concerns about. And so if I'm sitting across from a 14-year-old, not believing that they're a caricature and that they agree with all of the sociocultural movements, but perhaps asking some really open-ended questions to appreciate how they got to where they are. One other thing I'll say, maybe just to start the conversation here, is thinking through the ways in which gender stereotypes get communicated in our faith communities and the ways in which that may do harm to people in this space, where it actually reinforces something that I think we as Christians would say we don't agree with, which is that there's one way to be a man and there's one way to be a woman in the world. And the more we double down on rigid stereotypes in our faith communities, the more we magnify the experiences of gender minorities and can make people feel as if they don't belong by virtue of maybe some differences in how they express or experience their gender.
Mm-hmm. So the book is Gender Identity and Faith. Tell me a little bit about what the book is about, who is written for, and what you hope to accomplish through it.
Yes, so Gender Identity and Faith is really a book for clinicians. So if you're listening and you know therapists or you yourself are a therapist, this is your book for how do we effectively meet the needs of clients coming in for whom faith is a very important facet of their life or has been a part of their life for some time. And they're trying to figure out, what does it look like to integrate my experience of gender in keeping with my beliefs and values? And how do I do that in a balanced, kind of gradual way, as opposed to believing that there's only one way to resolve my experience of gender identity? And so that's more of the framework of the book. And the reason for it, what we're hoping to accomplish, is give clinicians who are well-meaning, who are working with conventionally religious people and their families, concrete tools to develop more of a posture and a confident approach to how they're engaging with gender minorities in therapy. What we were seeing and continue to see a lot, Mark and I, when we do trainings, is just a real trepidation and fear among clinicians of how do we do right by people in this space, and especially people who may have questions about some of the sociocultural shifts that we've seen in the last 20 years. And so really equipping clinicians is the goal, and doing so in a balanced, psychologically minded way that is ethical, which doesn't always happen when I think clinicians have their own anxieties about how to do right by people.
It's difficult because the way in which we talk about gender identity or sexual minorities as a society, it comes within the context of what we call the culture wars, and that never foments good discussion. It's an issue we've seen politicized. It gets so much so, bathroom bills, sports participation, and pronouns. It's like the trifecta. And and even now, just if you mention the word pronouns, you're going to get a whole section of Twitter angry at you for that. And you're like, we're not having any discussion of meaning or substance, and the humanity of people, regardless of their gender experience, is being lost amid all of this. What can we do to get rid or push away those less helpful conversations and begin to cultivate more helpful conversations?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the first step is what you're doing right there, Josh, which is recognizing how easily we can get swept up in that. And I think on the front end, it will be catching ourselves. When we start to feel ourselves get activated, angry about some debate. So somebody talks about their own gender identity or that of a friend. Maybe your child comes home from school and says, "Oh, Mom, my friend today said they're non-binary." And you start to feel that activation happening, the anger, the frustration, the fear response. What does this mean about the culture and where we're moving? And to really slow that down. Oh my gosh, I'm responding to my kiddo right now. And how do I show them that I want them talking about these things with me? And so if I respond with anger, if I respond with fear, if I respond with dismissiveness, then my child is probably not going to look to me as a resource in their conversation. They're going to look to the dominant narratives in the culture. And so to your point, recognizing when we start to do that, slowing that down, even as something as simple as taking a few deep breaths and saying, okay, my child is telling me about a friend at their school and something that friend told them about today. How do I be non-reactive in this moment and simply, if nothing else, take in what they're saying. Oh, thanks so much for telling me what your friend told you today at school. And then perhaps when I'm not as upset or activated, circling back and doing something that a dear friend, Meg Batts, has talked with me about, which is, how do we communicate a position about perhaps norms of sex and gender that are in keeping with our Christian beliefs, and do that while also communicating a posture to people who are exploring and actively asking these questions. So perhaps a position is that, I don't believe that gender is purely on a spectrum and that there's no norms that have value around gender identity. And that's my position on gender identity theory. But my posture towards, this kid in your class, honey, is that I want them to be able to come over to our house for play dates, and I want to get to know them better. And I'm so glad that you can be a friend to them. So that would give you one example of kind of how do we move into more meaningful conversation and perhaps think through, what is my posture? What do I want that to be? And what is Christ calling me to in the particular relationships with people he puts in my path? I think we've done a little bit more work thinking about our position on gender theory as Christians, which I'm not opposed to, and I think there's value to that, and a lot less on how do we effectively engage with real people. And that would be a much more fruitful thing to take to prayer, I think, than simply the fears and anxieties about some of the socio-political shifts that we're seeing today.
Mm-hmm. An important foundation of the book is something I think that Mark talks about in all his books, the three different lenses through which people perceive gender identity. Can you give us an overview of those perspectives and which one you feel is most helpful?
Sure. So the three lenses, you're right, Mark Yarhouse really coined this early on in some of his development of an approach to gender identity. Three lenses through which people often view these conversations, one being integrity lens, one being disability lens, one being diversity lens. And they're called their names not because Mark is saying or I'm saying the integrity lens has the most integrity, but because people in that group would talk about gender identity using some of the language of the titles of those lenses. So let me explain what I mean by that. People who are drawn to an integrity lens would be those who really emphasize God's creational intent for sexuality and gender identity. And so when we're thinking about things like gender dysphoria or gender atypical expression, people from that lens would say that, God had a plan in Genesis 1 and 2. And when people experience a gender identity that's different from male and female, they are willfully disobeying God's creational intent. It's a violation of the integrity of male-female distinction. So people out of that lens would say the solution then for gender dysphoria is repentance, almost of like a sin condition. And so the desire to cross-dress would be seen in moral categories and moral terms. So that's integrity lens. And why do people say it's the integrity lens? Well, people in that lens say it has the most biblical integrity, again, drawing primarily from Genesis 1 and 2, not exclusively that. The disability lens, people would say, hey, wait, let's talk about Genesis 3, the fall of humanity. And so there are many ways in which gender identity, like every other experience, is touched by the fall. And people who are drawn to this lens might say that, gender dysphoria would be then a consequence of the fall, almost likened like a disability to be responded to with compassion and empathy. So distinguishing that from the integrity lens, we would say disability lens people would not put it purely in moral categories. They would say that the gender dysphoria is a non-moral reality to be treated with compassion. And so what's the kind of approach there as you accompany people in this fallen world? And then that brings us to the diversity lens, which is really the dominant represented lens in our culture today. Certainly my field of psychology overwhelmingly is drawn to this lens, which would say that gender differences, so gender identities beyond male and female, are expected, normative, and to be celebrated. They tell you something about a person's identity, who they are, their community, where they belong, and the way to discover meaning and purpose in their life is to adopt an alternative gender identity, which ought to be celebrated as another form of human diversity. And so what do you do out of that lens? You celebrate gender dysphoria as an expression of normative gender identities. And so you can see how quickly we speak past each other when we look at how different each of these three lenses are in their presuppositions and also the ways they would think about accompanying people. So you asked me which of the lenses do I think is most helpful or best, and spoiler alert, I don't think any one of them fully helps us respond to gender minorities. Mark has, really coined this, but I'll riff off of some of what he's done there, which is just that, how do we take what is best in each of the three lenses, integrate them? So how do I do that, right? You may be wondering, and I think people listening will do this differently, which is what makes it such a worthwhile conversation. But for me, when I look at scripture, I do think that there is something good, blessed by God, about sexual distinctions in Genesis 1 and 2. I think there's something instructive there for us about the human person and about who God is, actually, and the ways in which he made us male and female at the beginning of time. And I think that's worth reflecting on, perhaps, and taking seriously. So I'm not prepared to be a strict diversity lens person who says that doesn't matter. And most extreme diversity people would say that binary actually does harm to all people. And I wouldn't take that. I think there's something to be savored and reflected on from the integrity lens. What I think the integrity lens is missing is effective pastoral care. And the moralization of gender diverse experiences. I don't notice people waking up one day and saying, I'd really like to have gender dysphoria. When I sit across from a 5-year-old who has had gender dysphoria since about age 3, they tell me, I know I'm born, let's say, female, and I would love to just be a female in the world, but I experience myself as a male. And that sucks for me. That is painful for me. And so I don't see people choosing these experiences. So I appreciate the disabilities lens's ability to highlight that we live in a fallen world. And I think we should take Genesis 3 very seriously. And so how do we help accompany people and offer compassion and understanding even to the challenges of a person who has an enduring experience they did not choose? And then the diversity lens, I think for many Christians, this is actually the hardest lens to appreciate. It confuses us to say there's anything of value. Many of the parents I meet with will say there is nothing of value in the diversity lens. And as I've sat with that one and reflected and brought it to prayer, I think some of the things that really strike me out of that lens is the way it does answer questions of identity, community, meaning, purpose for gender minorities. And it does that quite well. I mean, it gives quite a compelling vision for a life where they can thrive, And I don't see similar narratives being offered that are life-giving within our faith communities. And so I think even if the solutions offered by people who are strict diversity lens people are different than what I would offer, I can appreciate why it's so compelling, and I can take that back to my own prayer and say, what does it look like for a person with gender dysphoria to thrive as a person of faith? What does it look like for them to discover identity, belonging, meaning, purpose in their life? And do I care about helping them figure that out? And if I don't take the steps to communicate that care, then why am I surprised when they leave our faith communities? And so I think that's where the responsibility gets pulled for us to show up and to take seriously those questions that all humans ask. And how are we going to effectively offer and accompany people as they find their own answers for how they're going to find that in their life and hopefully in their faith.
Mm-hmm. It's a multifaceted, nuanced experience. And in the book, you have so many different case studies and vignettes that talk about the different ways different people experience gender dysphoria or transgender identity.
Right.
That it's not everyone feels exactly this. It's different people, different ages, and that want different things and find
Right.
different solutions, that what might be a healthy solution for one person would be deeply damaging for another person.
That's right.
And like one thing that I see in for example, in a disability framework or even the integrity framework might be a sense of, well, let's not think about it. You shouldn't be having these feelings. You shouldn't have that. So, it's bad. Let's revert back to whatever the stereotypical maleness or femaleness is, where the diversity lens almost does the opposite and just says, well, let's don't think about it. Let's just celebrate it and move on. And whether the person in the middle, again, seems like they get lost amid two different sides trying to pull them in two different directions, rather than letting that individual find out where they need to be at on that journey and what is going to be most affirming for them and will allow them to flourish. Because that answer is probably going to be different for different people in different contexts based on their different experiences.
That's exactly right. And I think there's, of course, it's simpler if we can give a one-size-fits-all approach for people, like, oh, here's the path for you. That feels clean, obvious. And what I always say to my clients is, you're a unique person. And, you do have particularities to your experience that no one else has. And yet you are not alone in having the experience of exploring or wrestling with gender identity. You're not alone in that. And what I don't want to do, and what I would encourage the audience not to do, is to prescribe an outcome in every case, or you mentioned this too, to kind of get fixated on how we got here. And that is a huge mistake I think that we make, is, well, how did we get here? And if the answer is, oh, we got here because this is normative, so that's it, just celebrate, that feels reductive of some of the experiences of some people for whom they wouldn't say that they are prepared to celebrate their gender identity in the ways that are commonly prescribed. And then on the other end, obsessing over how this came to be and trying to find causal pathways that aren't there and project those onto people, those also don't fully equip us to show up. It's not that, again, it's not important. It's that if that's all you fixate on, it's really becomes, in my mind, more about your comfort with cognitively understanding a phenomenon than about your care and love for another person. So I'm much more of the mind of, how do I help grow a person's own curiosity about their story, how they got to where they are, what factors very well may have contributed to the gender experience they have, without letting that be prescriptive then of what I'm going to say you have to do about this experience. Because to your point, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. If it was as simple as some of the common simplistic solutions offered to people today, everybody would do the same thing and we wouldn't have a conversation to be had anymore. And that's just not accurate and honest to the nuance of this discussion.
A few months ago, I interviewed Dr. Susan Harris Howell, who wrote a book called Overcoming Gendered Socialization, also through IVP. One of the key points of her book was that gender has these sociocultural components that are, kind of arbitrary, that we've seen in culture, that girls tend to get guided toward more domestic, gentler activities, and young boys toward more industrial or rowdy activities. So how much do you see gender as being an expression or influenced by sociocultural tradition?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's very fair to recognize that gender is influenced by sociocultural kind of experiences or phenomenon that get passed down generationally. I think I would differ with some gender theorists who say it's solely that it's solely a sociocultural phenomenon. And yet, I mean, it's certainly I myself, and I think all of us, are informed by culture in something as intimate and innate, to our experience of self as our gender. Certainly, I remember as a little girl believing that girls like to cook and feeling confused about why I didn't like to cook, why I wanted to be out playing football with my brothers. And that's not the same thing as gender dysphoria, actually, but you can see how those stereotypes play out in all of our lives. And So certainly, Josh, I think that happens here. And I really see that and the reactivity to that as part of the conversation about how we got to where we are with the current sociocultural shifts in gender. Is there's a strong reaction and pushback to the way in which many people have suffered because of rigid stereotypes. And again, I think being tempered in that to say, I don't know that all norms then are overtly doing harm in every case. And I think that's where we try to remain balanced. How does a framework help? And in what ways do the arbitrary things play out in our churches in ways that don't actually help anybody?
Yeah. Because one of the things, this is really something that I've been sitting with for the past couple of months, just really, thinking through it myself and then talking to experts as well, like you. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to give me an answer. We are increasingly seeing young people, Gen Z, pushing back against traditional gender expectations and gender roles. I was just reading a study from Ipsos. I think last year they found that Gen Z was 4 times as likely to identify as transgender, non-binary, or some gender queer categorization. When we rigidly define gender, especially in socialized terms, girls don't like to play with trucks, they don't climb trees, they aren't good at math. Boys don't take care of don't play with dolls, they won't take care of babies. Whatever it is that kind of pushes gender expression, to the sidelines. Well, that increases the middle of the conversation and makes there more area for people then to wonder, well, am I not, I don't feel male because I don't fit this stereotype, or I don't feel female because I don't fit this stereotype. So I must be non-binary. I must be, what do you think that rigidity is part of what's driving the increase in genderqueer identification?
Yeah, I think it's a really worthwhile thought experiment, because I think to say that it would have no impact on the expression and exploration of gender of young people today, I think that would be a mistake. I think we have to acknowledge that certainly stereotypes, that is the way they do harm, is that they can lead people to feel like, because I don't fit this box, where do I belong? And whether a person acknowledges or adopts a new gender identity out of that place or not, I think we can all agree that that's not a helpful messaging to communicate to young people who do tend to think a bit more black and white in some of these categorizations, at least early on. And so I have certainly seen times where that's the case, where a person is reacting to rigid stereotypes and believing, I have to adopt a different gender identity to reflect that almost as if I'm not allowed, if you will, to reside where I am. I have to make adjustments to account for the ways in which I feel different from my peers for gender-related reasons. I also, am thankful for friends and colleagues who would remind me, right, that it's not purely that some people will want to explain away all experiences of gender identity, of gender minorities as that, and that would be a mistake. I think people use language of social contagion to talk about, oh, people are catching this because of rigid stereotypes. And yet, I think that too is a bit simplistic to account for everybody's experience. And so that language also, I've written about this a good bit, but in my experience is intentionally or unintentionally antagonistic to frame it in purely those ways. But it is worthwhile to appreciate how, let's take our faith communities, for instance, how if I go on a women's retreat and we're doing crafts, and I've heard this many times, and the men's retreat, they get to go camping and hiking, and I live in Colorado, so I hike all the time, and I'm bummed, right? It's like, I don't want to make cards. I like making cards, but come on, I want to go on a hike. And, these are the ways in which I think even in the structures of small groups or faith community organizational facets of life, we can reinforce that, oh, women like to do this and men like to do this. And if I was 13, and I was once, and I didn't always align with stereotypes myself. Even if it, again, didn't make me question my gender identity, it did make me feel like I was less of a woman. And that is something I think we can push back on and care deeply about, but we've got to stay consistent with that. Then if a child is, painting their hair pink or dyeing their hair pink as a boy, I'm not prepared to say, oh, let me tell you who you are because you like the color pink. I mean, that's, we don't want to be overreactive to the ways in which people express themselves that we tend to put in gendered categories. And I would not want to villainize a young girl who wants to keep her hair short, for instance, to cope with gender dysphoria and to make that out to be more than it is. If we're really saying that your hair length doesn't prescribe your gender identity, we have to be consistent in that as Christians.
One of the more substantive issues in the current sort of conversation cultural milieu is whether or not prepubescent individuals who are expressing transgender identity should be allowed to artificially delay puberty. That seems rather extreme to me, and that's something that in past generations we wouldn't have had the technology or the medical ability to do something like this. But it also matters how many of those prepubescent children are we saying you're at the age of 8 or 10 are walking in, making a very complex and difficult decision that not even adults understand all the complexities of this. And we're asking a child to try to make that decision, with their parents. What approach do you think we should be taking with young children in particular who are expressing a diverse gender identity?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Yeah, you're asking all the easy questions today, Josh. Really, wow. But I'm grateful for them. So, I mean, in our book, Mark and I talk about the approach we take with young children, at least therapeutically, and we kind of talk about what we would describe as gender patience and scaffolding. So let me say what I mean about gender patience. So, we really do want to take a long-term view with kids and not prescribe an outcome prematurely. And by that, I mean, if a young boy, biological male, is wearing dresses and enjoys those and is with friends, maybe often playing female characters, we would not want to come to that kid and say, hey, would you like us to take you to get blockers? Because that's really prescribing an outcome for that, let's say, 8-year-old. And so I think we want to be careful about not pushing down any one path in the same way that I would not recommend to parents hiding all of the play clothes that are female. Again, if we're saying that the clothing we wear doesn't cleanly mean anything, it's simply play, then I wouldn't want to prescribe that you get rid of those clothes either. And so that patience does allow you to scaffold a little bit and set limits with kids. And by that, I do not mean, again, not allowing certain hairstyles, not allowing certain dress, but I mean, like if a kid is going into their neighbor's house and taking play clothes and borrowing them, then saying, well, we can't go into their neighbor's house and take their clothes. Maybe we'll get you some play clothes that you would like, but we're going to set a limit there. And not prematurely rushing a process of blockers. I mean, I work with a lot of very thoughtful parents. And so I want to be careful about how the rhetoric in the media can paint parents in this space as if they're willy-nilly, kind of rolling a dice and saying, oh, we're going to do blockers tomorrow. I mean, this is a really painful discernment for parents in the case that their child is really wrestling with gender dysphoria on a more physical level. So noticing breast development and having tantrums 3 nights a week of great distress. Mom, Dad, can you cut off my breast? I mean, that's a hard thing to navigate as a parent. And if you're being offered things that could help suppress those sex characteristics, that is a compelling offer when you've got a kid who's really in pain. And so I don't want to trivialize the parents either and misrepresent how much they wrestle over that option. To this point, I've seen most parents not go that route. And perhaps that's my sample size. There's a lot of, reasons for that as far as not having a ton of long-term research on how those blockers can impact a child's development over time. But I have seen parents benefit from looking into what that option actually entails, to be able to know what is it that would happen to the body of our child, what would be the impact of that, to help them make a thoughtful decision. And I wouldn't want people to scoff at or moralize the wondering about blockers. I would love to see our faith communities be places where we could critically evaluate that, discern that with a family, instead of saying, I can't believe you're even thinking of that. Don't you know how terrible that is for kids? It's like, well, I bet they do know. They've probably heard that from many people, but they're trying to figure out what will help their child. And it's not easy when there's not a ton of options out there. And so helping parents and myself as a clinician be patient with a child, not jump to conclusions through different ways of expressing themselves, allowing them to express themselves in ways that feel congruent at that age, and not being reactive to that or prescriptive of what that means about them long term. And it's hard because everybody wants to know what's going to happen. Where are we going to end up? And I think honest clinicians will tell you we don't know. And I don't know in the case of your child where they'll be 10 years from now, but I want them to be mentally stable and well to the best of our ability. And so we try to focus on things parents can do to be supportive, accepting, loving of their child, not mocking them for gender atypicality, protecting them from that kind of teasing in peer environments and church communities. And being an advocate for their child in those spaces. And you can do all that even without knowing where you stand on the blockers debate.
Thank you for taking time out of your day to be on the podcast program. Again, the book is Gender Identity and Faith by Mark Yarhouse and Julia Sadusky. This is an academic work. It is geared more toward clinicians. So this is a book that you can pick it up, you can read it, you're going to get a lot of good information about it. I got a lot of good information about it as a pastor, as a church leader. But there might be other resources that you would recommend that might be better for families. What would you recommend for, I think, parents in particular?
Yeah, so Mark and I came out with our first book that was really for parents, loved ones, the average layperson who wants to wrap their mind around gender identity a bit more. And so that book, Emerging Gender Identities, has some interesting resources within it as far as advice to parents and pastors. And so that's a bit more accessible and less clinical, although I'm getting some feedback that the gender identity and faith is helpful for a lot of people as well. So, take a look if that's of interest. I think for many people, just being able to keep up with what some of the researchers in this space are doing. So Mark Yarhouse has his research institute in Chicago. That's a great space to find books and podcast interviews and just upcoming research targeted at the experience of Christian parents as their young person is coming out. And so for parents listening, I think that would be helpful to you. Mark and I offer consultations to families. And so that's something, if you were, actively walking this out as a family, we're available as resources to accompany people and think through some of the complex questions that many people are asking in this space when you have a loved one for whom this is their story. And then finally, I do offer consultations and workshops to faith-based institutions, so churches and schools who are really trying to better accompany young people and children who are wrestling with gender identity. And so, if a podcast is of interest, you can track us on things we're doing like this here today, or bringing us in as speakers, myself or Mark and others, to really offer some of that forward thinking about how can we do better than we have in the past.